Thanks for joining. I want to talk today a little bit more about faith in the age of AI, and I am waiting its publication right now. It'll be released in a few weeks, but of course, you may be watching this long after that date. But I want to talk about the Jewish influences in this book. I thought that it was important to talk about them. And the last episode, I talked about C.S. Lewis, Michael Polanyi, Owen Barfield, and people who we might call that Oxford revival from the 50s to the 60s, or late 40s to the early 60s. A few years ago, I was in Barnes and Noble. Some of you will remember there used to be a big thing in America called bookstores, and they were places where you could go and actually buy physical books and talk to people who are actually knowledgeable about books. That's a little facetious. But I always loved browsing around in these bookstores. I'd almost always buy something. Sometimes I would surprise myself. This was one of them. And the author is Abraham Joshua Heschel, and it is called God in Search of Man. Wow. It's an easy to read book, but one that you'll read again and again and again. And its thought is so profound and life transforming about a man who was concerned about his life with God. And that's very, very obvious from, of course, a Jewish perspective. A little bit later, I had another surprise with a great book, and this one was called The Beginning of Wisdom. And it's written by Leon Kass, and it's a commentary on the book of Genesis. Now, Heschel is easy to read. You'll think about him for years, and his phrases will stick in your head. But Leon Kass is not so easy to read. You have to work at digesting him, and his work though is transformational. When I finished reading The Beginning of Wisdom, I felt like I had a new understanding of the Scripture itself, including the New Testament. And I'll be forever grateful to him for this book, one of the greatest books of my life that I read, that its impact on me is just simply immeasurable. And then I wanted to mention as well Franz Rosenzweig, and The Star of Redemption. This man lived right before Hitler. He died as Hitler had come to power, and he's one of the great Jewish philosophers of the 20th century. He had ALS, and so he finished this book by batting his eyes at a board with letters on it so his wife could painstakingly put together the last part of The Star of Redemption. His book is not easy reading either. It's major philosophical work, but he was on the verge of converting to Christianity, and as the Nazi movement began to emerge, he believed that it would be a betrayal of his people and not consistent with the spirit of the times and what the times required of him as a sacrifice. But he had read through the church fathers, the patristic writings of the first 500 years of Christian thought, and he was convinced that that represented a kind of a Christian Talmud. Well, you can see the impact of all of this in his book, The Star of Redemption. I could mention other Jewish writers. Martin Buber certainly had an impact on me as well, and Rabbi Neusner. These are writers that have had really, they had a formative impact on my thinking and awakened me to some of the themes of Scripture that I might have missed had I not read them. So as I've been going through the book, Faith in the Age of AI, trying to figure out whether we will ever think of as an AI program as sentient or conscious. What are we going to do with robots? How are we going to think of ourselves as persons in relationship to all of this? I found, as I said in my last episode, Lewis and Company of the Inklings, very formative, and also this other group of Jewish writers. And of course, VIctor Frankl. How could I have forgotten him? His book, A Man in Search of Meaning, or Man's Search for Meaning, is one of the greatest books of all times. No one should live after the Holocaust having not read this book. It's a short book, and you can read it in just a few hours, but it will leave you transformed, blessed, and obviously this man, he had encountered what it meant to be faithful to covenant. So anyway, I wanted to share the Jewish writers with you since I had talked about C.S. Lewis. Together, the Jewish writers, I think, impressed upon me something else that I believe Christians need in this moment, and that is a responsible re-engagement of the intellectual life with Christian revelation. I come from a tradition, and most of you do, that's watching this probably, in American Christianity, of a suspicion toward the intellectual life, as though people who think deeply are not likely to remain Christians or be faithful Christians or to have a spiritual life. Both C.S. Lewis and that group of Christian thinkers in the 50s and 60s at Oxford, and also the Jewish writers, they totally dismiss that as a possibility for a person of covenant. We are told in Scripture that we are to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, all of our mind, and all of our strength. Loving God with our mind, or as St. Paul says, our reasonable service. And when he says reasonable service, he doesn't mean like we use reasonable, that's just reasonable. He's talking about our rational act of worship, service meaning a worship service. In other words, that engaging the mind in the Christian revelation is a worship with the mind. And our whole being needs to worship God. The acts of service we do for others, our prayer, our worship, our stewardship of our resources, and also how we think about reality, about morality, about ethics, the way that we reason. And so in the book, Faith in the Age of AI, I've tried to press home the fact that Christians are going to have to recover from this long idea that ignorance can be a form of piety. These Jewish writers helped me with that, and I'm grateful. Well, thank you for joining me, and we'll just continue to work our way through various aspects of faith in the age of AI. I welcome you to buy the book, of course, and to interact with me with those thoughts, either in agreement or disagreement. That's another thing that Jewish people taught me. You can still be faithful to covenant and disagree with other people who are faithful to covenant, and you can argue without disliking the person with whom you're arguing. That's something we also need to recover. Thanks for joining.